Today I'm going to talk about towards understanding and building embodied intelligence. This is joint work with my colleagues at Stanford Vision and Learning Lab. So evolution over the last 4 billion years have generated a variety of endless forms most beautiful, starting from an ancient bilaterian worm and culminating in the vast variety of animal life forms which we see around us. In fact, these animals display remarkable degrees of embodied intelligence by leveraging their evolved morphologies to accomplish complex tasks. However, in contrast, the progress in AI recently has been mostly in disembodied setting, and it has basically been fueled by large-scale static data sets and supervised learning. And these learned algorithms have no notion of agency or causality or even embodiment. In contrast, the field of embodied AI posits that intelligence takes a holistic perspective towards intelligence and states that intelligence is a function of the morphology, the controller, and the environment in which the agent is situated in. And hopes that by taking this holistic perspective, we can create agents which might one day live and work alongside us. So despite the importance of embodied intelligence, the principles governing these embodied AI is not well understood. So what do I mean by principles? In their Turing address, Al Newman and Herbert Simon argue in favor laws of quantitative structure. So an example of qualitative laws in other fields is like germ theory or cell theory. And recently, there has been some interesting progress, even in AI, in terms of getting or building these laws. So for example, you have scaling laws for language models or transfer learning. In the embodied AI setting, people have studied the relationship between morphology and control complexity. So similarly, we focus on understanding the relationship between the environmental complexity, the evolved morphology, and the learnability of intelligent control. So we focus on two particular questions. So the first question we ask is, do morphologies evolved in complex environments generalize to novel downstream tasks? And the second question we focus on is, does evolution select for morphologies which learn faster? But before we can do that, we need a system which can create embodied agents. And as you can imagine, there are various challenges in doing so, but I would like to highlight two main challenges. So the first challenge is that the search space of possible morphologies is really large, even if you have a simple design space. And the second challenge is that given a particular morphology, you have to evaluate it. And in order to evaluate it, you have to learn intelligent behavior in complex environments, which is extremely compute intensive. We are obviously not the first to tackle this problem, and people have been trying to do this for the last 30 years, starting from all the way work by Carl Sims to recent work by Ha et al. But the basic principle has been the same to tackle the first challenge. That is, you somehow try to artificially restrict the design space. You keep the design space simple so that you don't have a large search space. To tackle the second challenge, what people have tried is basically have an efficient way to evaluate fitness. So how you can do that is you can avoid learning adaptive controllers via RL, and you can instead have hand-designed controllers. You can predict the fitness of a morphology, or you can transfer weights across generations. So one thing I would like to highlight here is that despite using these heuristics, none of this work is able to evolve morphologies for complex tasks. The task is still simple of locomotion on a 2D flat terrain. So in order to tackle these challenges, we introduce a simple bi-level framework, which we call DERL. So at its core, it is a two-level optimization framework, with the outer loop being distributed asynchronous evolution, and the inner loop is reinforcement learning from low-level sensory observations. So let's look at the outer loop first. So traditionally, how people tackle the outer loop is by something called generational evolution. So you have, let's say, n workers, and all of these workers in parallel would mutate and then evaluate fitness via lifetime learning. And then you would synchronize. Basically, you would wait for all of these agents to finish evaluation. You will select the top agents, and then you will repeat the cycle. So as you can see here, after each cycle, you have a synchronization bottleneck, and you can't scale easily. So what I just introduced was one extreme of the possibility of evolution. So Here, we were replacing the entire population simultaneously, but in general, you have a whole spectrum of possibilities. On the other extreme, you can also have something called steady state evolution, where you just replace one individual at a time. And if you think about it, it really makes our life easy because now you don't have to do any sort of synchronization. You can just focus on your local small population, and you can do this process independently across nodes which might be on different machines, and you can just scale out. So we basically use this technique, steady state evolution, for our distributed asynchronous evolution. And as you can see here, now you have these n workers in parallel, and none of these workers have to communicate with each other. You do your small evolution loops in parallel, and you maintain the population size by using something like regularized evolution or aging evolution. And for inner loop, we use off-shelf model-free algorithms like PPO, and you learn from low-level sensory observations like proprioceptive features and exteroceptive features like height field information, or some task-specific features like the location of boxes or goal location. We also had to design our own design space, which is expressive. So we came up with something called UNIMAL design space, which is short form for universal animal. And the goal here was we were inspired by arthropods, and we wanted as diverse as possible expression in this design space. So as you can see here, you have all sorts of quadrupeds, bipeds, hexapeds in this design space. We consider 3 different types of evolutionary environments. So the first one is evolution on flat terrain. It is the simplest environment which has been the focus of prior work, and the goal is to just move forward as fast as possible. The second environment is variable terrain, where you have like 3 types of obstacles. You have hills, you have rugged obstacles, and you have curved obstacles. And finally, third task, which is the most challenging task, is you have this box in this variable terrain which you have to manipulate to the goal location. And if you notice, in all three environments, the number of subtasks which the agent has to solve in order to survive increases. And we use this notion of subtasks to roughly quantify the environmental complexity. So let's look at some evolved morphologies. So what I'm showing here are some agents evolved in flat terrain. So one thing you would notice is that the techniques which work in one environment would not work in another environment. So the behavior is different, and also the morphology is different. So for example, in the variable terrain example, the agent was much more symmetrical and could not move by falling forward. And in this manipulation in variable terrain environment, it's repurposing its legs as basically claws or arms. So what I'm describing right now is a very qualitative way to describe these morphologies. And what we were interested in was to somehow figure out that can we quantify the intelligence embodied in these morphologies. So what do I mean by morphological intelligence? We take inspiration from representation learning literature, where you evaluate the quality of a representation by basically evaluating on downstream tasks. So if you perform better on downstream tasks, you say that an algorithm is better, or the learned representation is better. So we use this insight, and we posit that intelligent morphologies should similarly facilitate faster and better learning of tasks. So we have a bunch of morphologies which we get after learning and evolution, and we basically throw away the controller and train these morphologies from scratch. So any difference in performance would be only because of the morphology. So we create a suite of tasks to test different capabilities like agility, stability, and manipulation capabilities. So these 8 environments were basically downstream tasks targeting these 3 different capabilities. So what I'm showing here is the average performance of 10 best agents evolved in 3 different environments for one task of patrol. And as you can see here, agents which were evolved in more complex environments on average perform better. And this trend holds across all 8 tasks. So we find that morphologies evolved in complex environments indeed perform better, which shows the intertwined relationships between the morphology and the environment in which it is evolved. We further test how the performance varies if you reduce the learning budget. So now we reduce the number of iterations given to these agents by 1/5. And surprisingly, we find that the performance difference is even more stark. So you would see here that across all 8 environments, morphologies which evolved in more complex environments now even learn faster. Now, the speed of learning motivated our next question, which was, does evolution inherently select for morphologies which learn faster? And an extreme case of an extreme case of fast learning is something called innate behaviors. And this is very common in animal kingdom. So you can see like web making in spiders or swimming in aquatic animals, nest making in birds. All of these behaviors are present at birth. And scientists have thought about how these behaviors come into being. So one hypothesis was put forward by this scientist called Baldwin, and his key insight was that learning itself can be costly. So it's not always beneficial. So for example, if you take this case of a deer, a baby deer, it cannot take like years to learn how to walk or run, because there is an opportunity cost, there is a learning cost, and it can get eaten if it takes like its whole life to learn. So he posited that evolution, over the course of many generations, will find genotypic modifications which lead to faster phenotypic learning. And that is how you might see something called innate behaviors. So we try to showcase this in the morphological setting. So here what I'm showing is across 3 environments, the time taken to achieve a particular level of fitness. So if you focus on just the first environment, the flat terrain, you would see that in the initial generation, it took around 3 million iterations to learn something. And by the 10th generation, that same time was reduced by around 50%. So this shows that time required to achieve a particular level of fitness reduces over the course of evolution, demonstrating a morphological Baldwin effect, although in silicon. Now this motivated us to look at can we replicate this same setting in controllers? So what we showed here was certain morphologies are enabling learning of behavior faster. So can we also have certain pre-trained controllers which can enable faster learning? And this has been very successful in deep learning. So you have these large web scale data sets, you do self-supervised learning, and then it generalizes to a variety of downstream tasks. But in case of robotics, you have to basically train the controller each time for every new robot. So can you somehow avoid this and have a universal controller or shared controller? So it might not be always possible, but we posit that for modular robot design spaces where there's a lot of shared structure, you can maybe pre-train them, like pre-train on a large collection of robots, and then hope for zero-shot generalization to variations in dynamics, kinematics, or even to new tasks. But this is extremely challenging because all these different robots will have different degrees of freedom, different joints, and also different behaviors. And our key insight was that maybe we can just treat morphology as another modality and handle the differences in joints by just leveraging transformers. So traditionally, how you learn policy is by just giving as input proprioceptive or exteroceptive informations. So in addition, we also now give morphology representation as input to the transformer. So if you have a morphology, you just create 1D sequence of this morphology, and then you take a standard transformer and you process it. So here I'm showing like this, our simple algorithm can basically control all of these different diverse morphologies. Each morphology has around 15 or 20 degrees of freedom, and for challenging tasks of locomotion on a variable terrain. And you would notice that all of them have different behaviors, different gait patterns, but a single policy can do that just by conditioning on the morphology information. But what is even more interesting is that if I take a controller which was trained on variable terrain, and if I try on a completely new task and completely new set of morphologies, so like this escape terrain, where you are instantiated in the center and you just have to escape this hilly region, we are still, okay, I think the graph is not showing, but what you can see here is that you get extremely good zero-shot performance. And you can also have the same fine-tuning paradigm, where if you start from these representations and fine-tune, you get around 3x efficiency gains. So to conclude, we basically first proposed a framework called DERL, which enables us to scale the creation of embodied agents. We leverage DERL to understand some scientific insights into these processes of evolution and learning. And finally, we take some small steps towards general purpose controllers, which can bring these successful paradigm from disembodied setting to embodied setting.